All right, today's lecture is on organization, and I picked this photo. You know, every lecture you see some city up there, and you go like wonder whether this is kind of arbitrary, picturesque kind of things or not. But in terms of organization, if you look in the foreground, this is the Forbidden City, and in the background is what is modern, quote, modern Beijing. And if you look at the two and you look at the practice of design and building, I think it speaks for itself in terms of a time when object, territory, and systems were integrated under one system of thought with respect to cosmology and the order of the world. And now we have a kind of a free market going on in the background, and that has implications for everyone who's here. So far, we've talked about the general framework for practice, paradigm shifts in practice, paradigm shifts in the built environment. Design operations was last time. Today we're talking about organization, and the final lecture in a couple of weeks will be on practice strategies. I'm doing these reprises every lecture just because I think repetition bears has some merit on its own terms. But what I hope you'll do is continue to think about some of these diagrams. They're very simple and straightforward, but in actuality, if you think about them carefully, you realize there are different levels of thought regarding what it is. And today, in terms of organization, if we go back to the essential model of practice, the context, which is the thing that you think is relevant, and the conditions where the objective conditions that you face, impacts vision, and this kind of constantly working back and forth between your own vision for practice and an evaluation of the conditions of practice, and the context, which is the part where your own imagination and knowledge actually affects your choices in terms of how you direct that vision, continues to play a role in how you organize practice. We went through the issue of craft-based practices and the evolution from the 50s to the present in terms of different implementations of what was kind of driving the practice model in terms of the commercial world. And I'm going to start pulling up other pieces of information so that when you look at this context in terms of a timeline, it's not arbitrary that these things happened from an objective perspective. If you look at the population of the world, in 1950 there's an inflection point, and you can see where population growth globally then took off, and actually in the urbanization of the world took off. And so going from simply a craft model of practice up through strategy and issues is not unrelated to the fact that it's calibrated to population growth, the rise of cities, and the rise of the developing nations. Also, the modernist built environment paradigm, which kind of took object, territory, and systems, and unlike the photo of the Forbidden City, made them kind of deconstructed them so that they could float independently and have these almost arbitrary overlaps that essentially tracks capitalism and the development of a market economy to take these things and actually make them free-floating. So you take a look at the Paseo de la Reforma in Ciudad de Mexico in the 1950, and you take a look at it today, and you can see that this system of dissociation actually produces an urbanism which might have its interesting points, but then has also systemic problems in that each accretion of the city then creates systemic problems, basically transportation, water systems, infrastructure, all of these things, energy problems, environmental issues. And so the struggle as we enter another era of increased population and megacities is, you know, how do we experiment again with a reintegration of object, territory, and systems? And these are experiments that are being conducted by a number of different practices in the US and abroad, where a new synthesis for the city is trying to be hatched, where if you go back again to the Forbidden City, the interdependency of buildings, so they don't, each building in the Forbidden City, history does not repeat itself, so we're not going to go back there. But what I'm saying is that each building within the city is interdependent with the other. It's not this idea that the object is a freestanding thing, but that we're constantly looking, again, as architects, on integrating and making things interdependent rather than independent. And last time we looked then at a deconstructed model of professional design operations, where we talked about each of the linkages between strategy, content, delivery, and design. And in particular, we're looking at the fact that going from the business of craft-centered architecture to one that is engaged with issues, that the linkages between strategy, content, and design have become much more pronounced. And if you want, later on in the next lecture, actually the monetization of the value of your role as designers can be linked to each of these linkages, that certain firms have made conscious choices about which linkages they choose to strengthen, and that has more power in the marketplace, frankly. The other thing we talked about was the need for the curation of knowledge, not only to develop it, but to document, disseminate, and the discourse around knowledge requires that practice actually take this system of design, content, delivery, and strategy and integrate it within the platform of practice in ways that people who are practicing can understand what they're doing and navigate it. But without a certain amount of curation of the knowledge ongoing, you don't even know what you're doing, right? So imagine Disney Hall, or imagine Tom Main's Far Tower. You get a commission, you don't even know before you're doing the design what you're going to face in terms of knowledge, and yet if you don't understand the different areas of knowledge that you can draw upon, it's sort of like a conductor who doesn't know what each part of the orchestra does, so you don't know how to assemble, you don't know even how to assemble your team. So the condition of architects right now is not like the craftsmen of old, where you knew the kind of knowledge that you would face going into an engagement. Right now you don't know, because you have no idea where you're coming. A good architect actually will not know the answer going in. So you face your problems in ignorance, and without the ability then to have a platform of knowledge upon which you can rely, is that then you're stuck, right? You have things that you need to know, but you don't know where to go with it, the next step. So this is an important aspect of practice at the present time. And then we started to talk about how you organize yourself for practice in teaming people who then understand how to integrate these design domains. Okay, so today is the organization of practice. And organization, I realized, can be thought of in many different ways. And when I talk to students and they talk about organization of practice, they actually may be interested in any one of these following areas, right? So you can look at the strategic organization of practice as it relates to your ability to insert yourself within a value chain or a value constellation of activity. So as society needs something from us, or perceives the need, or we invent the need, how do you strategically organize yourself to practice in that space? That's one possible interpretation of organization. Another one could be, a lot of students ask about legal organization and requirements of practice, which in and of itself is a subject of great interest, because when you practice not locally, but you practice it nationally, or you practice internationally, legal organization counts, and it is one of those things which, in the one hand, is a barrier to entry into different markets, but also as a defense locally against people who don't know the local conditions. So the sword cuts both ways on legal organization, which is, it's a protection for the preservation of local knowledge and practice. It's also a barrier to entry, so we can talk about that. People think also of how you operate in the functional organization of firms and platforms. It's like, what are the pieces, the working pieces of a firm, and how do they work together? Organization also impacts communications, which the internet has suddenly deconstructed how formal organization works. So the old pyramid structures of old that everyone knows, it's gone, right? You can draw it on a piece of paper, it doesn't mean anything. Communications has revolutionized the way in which stakeholders communicate with each other. Social media has actually amped up that, the effects of network communications. And so that's another subject for how do you organize a practice where the communications that underlie the practice itself cannot be monitored, right? And then finally is about culture, which is how socially we organize and hold social capital as professionals that allow us to make progress as a group of people and not just singular individuals. So all these things are under the rubric of organization. And so when I'm talking about organization, we can talk about any one of these things, and they're all kind of interrelated. So have your questions ready, okay? I'm going to hit you up with business school stuff now. This is one diagram that actually it's worth writing down if you have a pad of paper and pencil. It is the way, it's a classic way of understanding, and when I go into a firm and try to understand what the issues are with a practice, I look at each one of these linkages between the firm's strategic vision, or where they're headed, how they're positioned within the areas of practice that they want to pursue, the markets and clients which are either available or potentially available to them, the processes that they pursue as architects, and these processes are internal. So how do you do work? How do you organize and accomplish what you're going to do? And then the organization piece is how do you organize yourself for practice? But organization in this case is legal, it's resources, people, right? Teams, how do you organize your teams? And so each of these linkages and the analysis of these linkages is something that systemically, if you go through in an organized way, any one of you looking at, I'm going to devolve now into your interest in finding work and other things when you get out of here, is that if you look at anyone's web page and you do an analysis based on that, I guarantee you'll know more about their practice than they do when you walk in. Because very few architects have actually taken the time to look at it. But a casual analysis of anyone's web page, you can actually deconstruct what it is that they're saying. And then you go and you can probably amaze some people about what you know about them, even though they didn't necessarily want to share that with you. Look, in traditional terms, when we look at these diagrams, and we look at how where our participation is in traditional terms, this is the physical construction value chain of where we are cited as designers physically, okay? So, you know, you have everything from building product manufacturers to distributors to subcontractors, constructors. This is the universe, the chain which then a sponsor, meaning a client or a client agent, works on behalf of an owner-operator that then either has an end user at it and has permanent financing for, but we, as a regulated professional practice, are cited in a very specific way vis-a-vis other people who have input into the building process. We are not independent of how the rest of the value chain works. And in this country, there's a very specific value chain. In California and Los Angeles, it's even more specific. So, you know, not understanding this is part of the problem that actually school can't address, because it's so specific to place and culture that you can make basic fundamental errors as a practitioner, assuming that that value chain is the same in every location. So there's a not so amusing story that when I was with OMA, or associated with them, we were doing an embassy in Berlin. But we assumed, wrongly, that Dutch construction administration practices were the same as in Germany. And we were wrong. So, you know, our normative kind of assumptions about how value is actually delivered for a project was wrong, and it had major consequences in terms of staffing, in terms of fees, and everything else. So this is not a trivial analysis that is not part really of a designer's education in school, but when you get out of school is something that you need to kind of come to grips with. Set against that is the reality that we don't act like that value chain diagram anymore. We act like that, which is everyone is emailing everyone else. So when you actually get into the project, it doesn't look like the first diagram. It actually looks like that, which is that it is a free-for-all of back and forth communications. And if you're not organized within your practice to deal with this level of informal as well as formal communications, you've got yourself a mess, right? It's just, in actual practice, the internet has made it impossible to monitor this, except, you know, there are attempts then to have project websites and other things that centralize that data so that there's a recording device for all of these kinds of communications. But in actuality, what's happened is that the authority structures that have what made top-down management possible of organizations is actually vanished. And so what does that really mean in terms of how you make practice? It also has a problem with regard to authorship, okay? The issue of authorship in craft is that you have control over the communications and the value chain that actually created what you design. The minute you lose the ability to control that, it doesn't, individual authorship kind of doesn't mean very much. It's actually, you can be a very key participant in it, but it's much flatter in terms of how things get created, okay? So what we're talking about organizationally has implications for people's mindset about what's actually going on. There is a great mythology in architecture that, you know, individual geniuses are floating around here designing big structures, et cetera, and that is becoming less and less true, okay? And it's a team sport now. There may be leaders in the team, but it is definitely a team sport. So the distinctions we can map. We can look at formal organizational structures based on ideas of internal coherence. And a lot of issues right now in larger practices is that because they're so diverse, there's a increasing lack of coherence internally about what the organization actually means. So if you go to really big companies, one of the common complaints among staff is, well, we're working for you, but what does the company stand for? What does it mean? Where are we going? And they look to formal organizational structures to help solve that issue. It's probably not going to be solved that way. It's really a cultural issue and one of managing an environment rather than a structure. But we'll get to that in a minute. Communication structures based on social organization are probably more where it's at, where the thing is held together virtually in a cultural environment. And the other thing that is most important for everyone is the structure of affiliations, which allow us to function more broadly as professionals rather than more narrowly. So we'll go through each of these areas. I'm going to talk about internal coherence first. Okay, this is, I'm going to use an example of the firm Me, Myself, and I, which all of you who want to be independent practitioners sooner rather than later will start in a garage with a firm named Me, Myself, and I. Okay, so me will be the entrepreneur who will go out, and your basic function is what as an E? It's to explain to others what your value in the world is and why anyone in their right mind would want to give you a break and hire you, right? You're hunting for opportunities, but the hunting requires you to do what? Requires you to articulate what it is you're about. You have to articulate a message. You have to say what you're good for, what you can do, and why you're doing it, right? Some basic stuff. So say you're successful, so you're an E, congratulations. And now you have to produce the stuff, right? So you go back to your garage and you do what you say, hopefully you do what you said you were going to do. And hopefully you have the presence of mind to ask for a fee, and hopefully at some point you collect the fee, you pay your bills, so you balance your checkbook on weekends, and that's the I function, which is the infrastructure necessary to do it, right? And you clean up your office. So me, myself, and I is one person. So now you're successful, you've got more work, and the first trauma of your life comes because now you have to hire someone else who is not going to go with you to the meetings to represent what it is that you're going to do. And you're going to hire them, and they're going to do what? They're going to help you produce the work, right? So the first trauma of life is that now you have to supervise someone, and you have an overlap between what you've represented, which is E, and the production of it, which is P, and the overlap EP, which means you come back to the garage, that person's waiting eagerly to figure out what they're trying to figure out what you need them to do. And here comes the first thing. They may not do what you ask them to do. They'll do what they want to do, thinking that it's better than what you told them to do, right? So this is the first problem, which is that overlap is, there's a flaw in it because at some point the other person has free will, and you are trying to supervise that person. Now imagine going on like that, you're successful. So you have 5 people in the garage, okay? And you're going out getting work, and what happens to EP? Guys, you have 5 people waiting in the garage for you. What's your major problem? You have to communicate with them, right? You have to communicate what it is that needs to be done. You need to organize the work, etc. So how many people can you do that for without going crazy? Not so many. At some point, you need someone else who understands what you're about, who is on the same wavelength, and can take some of the responsibility for the overlap, which means that you can explain it to someone else, or they may go with you to the meeting, and they can help you manage the production of the work, right? Because if you don't, what is your risk? Your risk is it won't get done. It won't get done the way you thought it should be done, and you can't do it all yourself. So now you have 6 people in the garage. 3 of them are full-time, 3 of them are part-time, 2 of them are on standby. You charge people money, but you're having trouble getting your bills out on time because that's an I function. So now what? You don't get cash because you didn't send your bills out, right? So then what happens? Then you say, I can't pay you. And then they all walk out on you. No, you're smarter than that. First, you enlist someone to help you with bookkeeping and to help you send the bills out, okay? So this then starts making that domain, which is you've produced, you need someone to manage the studio, right? This is managing the work. This is managing the studio. So new people show up, they have to have software, they have to have computers, they have to know what's going on. Someone has to do the books. Okay, now you have 8 people. 5 of them are full-time, 3 of them are part-time, and 2 are on standby. So you have 10, but 2 are on standby. So now you want to know whether you can hire another person full-time, but you don't know what your cash flow is going to be. So your bookkeeper, who's great at keeping numbers, suddenly can't anticipate what your cash flow is going to be. They can tell you what your expenses are going to be, but they can't tell you what you're going to be making. So then this domain is born, which is that you need somebody who has navigational capacity, if it's not yourself, somebody, to project forward to know the in and out of your balance of accounts. And someone, incidentally, who might be your conscience to prevent you from being insane and going and doing something in business that's probably not going to work out too well. So this is the cycle of the birth of internal coherence in terms of management and the assignment, basically, of simple functions of running a practice. This is not necessarily completely applicable to large-scale practices, but I'm trying to give you the fundamentals of what these spaces mean, because each of you may find yourself wandering in and out of these different spaces. All architects, unless they're just purely a designer or purely a production person, will find themselves at one point or another wandering through this diagram. And the most dangerous part of it all is the center point, because in most design firms, the center point is empty. At some point, you have to integrate all the domains and control the enterprise. But in design firms, that's only a convening space to make decisions. In a large corporate firm, it's filled by the chief executive officer, et cetera, okay? So, let's go. So to be a good E, your job is really to articulate externally and internally the vision and mission of the firm, to provide organizational leadership, to represent the practice, what it is that you're doing, to decide on the strategic navigation of it, and to actually cultivate the clients and markets that allow you to do work. The entrepreneurial drive in almost every organization comes from people who are E's, okay, in terms of wiring. The P function is actually doing the work. So it's planning the work. It's actually doing all of the things that are required in order into professional operations to do it. Most craft-based organizations are started by P's and not by E's. And the problem in terms of craft-based practices is that because most people are interested in doing work and not developing work, that the need then for learning either how to be an E or how to get a partner who's an E is the trick, right? So if you look at firms like I.M. Pei and Partners in the old version of it, not the contemporary version, but when Mr. Pei was at the helm, he was actually not an E. He was actually more wired as a producer. He had worked for Zeckendorf and everything. So later in his life, he became more involved in the development of work. But the center of gravity of that practice was very much on the craft of architecture. And so that in actuality, as the firm developed and the market changed, it became harder and harder for that firm to have traction in the market unless they were sought out by clients who really wanted that craftsmanship. Everything from finance, accounting, human resources, legal. I know all of this stuff, probably your eyes are going to glaze over because you go, what does this have to do with me? But all of these things, at least in larger organizations, and large could be as little as 20 people. All of these functions exist in firms that are not that big. They may be covered by fewer individuals than in larger firms. But in order to run a firm, all of these areas have to be covered. So, if it's not you, somebody has to figure this stuff out. And again, the EP is where the business risk of the practice is. It's also the professional risk of the practice. In other words, if what you promise and what you produce are not in alignment, you have risk, which is that you didn't do what you said you were going to do, or it's not to the quality and standards you want. So in terms of design management, contract management, project management, relationship building, project staffing, business development, and negotiations, all of that is in that overlap. And the key for a lot of senior designers is, in design firms, some of the people who are at the second tier in these named design firms are in that space. So if you look at OMA, or if you look at Herzog and de Meuron, if you look at a lot of the famous design practices, UN Studio, Ben will be here on Wednesday, the second tier exists largely in the EP overlap because they are the guarantors of the performance of the firm. If you're in that space, you basically have the responsibility of guaranteeing that the firm will perform the things that it has promised and has represented. The the PI function is information exchange, so essentially it is the support to the rest of the firm in terms of the planning and management of facilities, of all the resources necessary to practice. And so that function in terms of everything from timesheets to identification of space, anticipation of technology needs, et cetera, is all contained in that space. Again, business planning, the EI overlap, fiscal management. When you go after work, the interplay is a lot between the pricing of your services and how you will go after things, so that all the support mechanisms in order for E to function comes from I. Normally, I get the call when this system doesn't work in a firm. So that essentially this propeller, which is EPPI, EI, that's where owners find themselves when they grow a firm. That if you're a founder of a firm, you're the only one with sufficient authority to manage those spaces, unless you're a very good delegator and you have very responsible people who are capable. The owner or founders wind up managing those spaces personally at some point, because they're the only one who have the authority to actually manage those spaces. Because everyone else is responsive. If you ask someone to do something, they're more than happy to do it. But the initiation, in any one of these domains, the question that's operative is, whose responsibility is it to initiate the question or the action? Because there are plenty of people who are responsive. There are lots of people who are cooperative. But it's like, who has the authority and the reason to speak up in order to defend that domain? And the overlap is the tricky part, because it's a negotiation. It's very rare that you can go across these domains without other people either objecting or requiring some sort of negotiation in order to resolve the issue, right? So even down to, you have people who need computers. They go like, why don't I have the latest software, blah, 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 right? Typical argument. And you're arguing with who? You're arguing with a CFO, an accountant, some sort of manager who has the purse strings. So there are always negotiations over these spaces. So why, after World War II, did they take that diagram and just make 3 names out of these companies? Is because, guess what? Each of these names, originally, that then became letters, were the E, the P, and the I. So if you come across these firms that originated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they have 3 initials, they're that diagram. That's what they did. Because each of the principals defended that territory, and they negotiated with themselves over the boundary, right? So that it was an efficient way of leveraging people who founded firms as a way to formulate corporate practices. So the corporate practices that came out of the 60s and 70s, or even earlier, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even into the 70s, this formula was literally that diagram. Okay? Now, they don't operate like that now because they're too big to operate like that, but they have, even within each office, they've mutated in a way that maybe each office location has some variation of that system, but it's essentially, I think it's funny that basically they took the diagram, they said, okay, if that's the way it's going to be, then we'll just have 3 partners. Now, when I showed this diagram to this man, he went like, oh, I have a different diagram for you, and he drew that one. He didn't like the other one because it actually was in balance. So in fact, in a strategic practice where you have a big vision thinker, his idea was, well, the E takes over the whole thing, and then you produce, but the production and the infrastructure is within the domain of the vision of the practice. And so that was his response to the other diagram, which I think was interesting because this is not OMA today. Actually, OMA probably looks a lot like the other diagram. But at the point prior to the Pritzker, I think this was very much the way the firm operated, which was that managers reported to designers, right? And managers were designers. This is the interesting thing, is that in this world, the best designers are also the managers, because they're the only ones who have their hand on the process of design in a way that makes any sense in this model. And in a corporate practice, designers and managers are either co-equal or designers report to managers. So something that you should be aware of. The problem with titles in firms is that project manager in a corporate firm does not mean project manager in a design firm. They're the same title, the behavior is totally different. The most efficient organization structurally for practices is a radial organization. Even if it's a really large corporate practice, essentially they break down into office locations and they run it as a radial organization, which means that there is a center core of a team that then is surrounded by satellites of people who manage either the EP overlap, right? They manage the propeller. So the people who manage the propeller are on the second ring, and then it goes out, and then authority is devolved from the center. But the center actually may be empty, it may just be the convening space. So if you look at the other diagram, and you look at this diagram, it's really then, when you look at formal organizational things and where people are sited vis-a-vis each other, it devolves into well, it's translated into a radial network. I'm sure Ben will talk about this on Wednesday, but this is UN Studios network. You can radial diagram. You can see in the center are the directors, and then as you go out, you have networks of people who are engaged in the knowledge platform, in production, and in research. But he sectorizes it, you see. So there's communications, business control, human resources, knowledge management. So it's not only radial, but it's sectorized. In market sector practices, things are done in a matrix fashion. This is highly expensive and inefficient, which is that you have people who are knowledge leaders, and then people who lead the office, and then in the corner are the executives, but then you have teams that are formed by having matrix along knowledge lines and then office locations. But this form of management is extremely slow and very, very expensive to maintain. So only the largest firms can actually maintain this. People like Leo Daly, there are others, HOK, they're basically matrix organizations. We come to the issue of scale in practice now. I mean, organizations at the small scale are fine. Those models that I showed you are almost pure when you have less than 100 people. But when you get to really large sizes, you just can't scale that model up. The problem is, in practice, here's the basic problem. When you get to be a certain size, the question is, as an architect, how do you maintain the resolution on the problems that you're given? In other words, if you look at a building by Lucan, it looks fine, 6 inches close or distant, right? I mean, there's a scale of resolution which is resolved at all of the multiple scales, urbanistically and to the detail. When you get to very large organizations, how do you maintain this kind of resolution in the work when in fact most of the work does not want to be resolved at that level? So in the matrix of value, right, the people who are actually making decisions don't have a very fine grain on the decisions that they're making. They make very large-scale decisions based upon generalities. So you have higher value financial added decisions, meaning a development strategy or a large-scale urban strategy, but it has no grain on it. Just it's a large-scale approach to a problem. Everyone wants to get from that box to a high-end product or outcome, which means that it has this kind of ability to have resolution at all of the different scales and in all of the different dimensions, parameters of a project. We, more or less, as professionals, occupy this box, which is considered to have a lower financial value, but we're asked to resolve all of our problems at a very high level of resolution. And a lot of the profession has devolved into service providers, which basically are involved in commodified products and outcomes, which is done at a fairly low resolution. So in terms of organizing ourselves for a high-end product, the problem is being able to maintain the level of attention to resolution and still wind up in that box, which takes what? Time and fees. So in running organizations, we consistently have to figure out how to extract the frictional cost of organizing ourselves in a way that everyone's reporting to everyone else, which takes time and money. And that's where we get down into the contemporary condition, which is that network structures are actually much more efficient in getting you to the high-end product and outcome than any of these other kind of right? That doesn't get you to a high-resolution thing. It requires too much coordination, and it's too slow in terms of turnaround. The radial organization is much more responsive, but then it requires you to act in this fashion, which is that it allows the information and knowledge to be distributed as well as decision-making at different scales. So your organization winds up looking more like that in reality and not like that, right? That is a fiction in terms of actually being able to work so that you have nodes of people who are engaged with other players in the value-added universe. And I think one of the major challenges of organizing for practice in the present is actually how to manage this environment, because it's becoming much more complex, because we have much more technology and specialized knowledge input. And the question is, how does anyone actually control the output of a product? Imagine a very complex building like CCTV or Tom Main's Far Tower. How do you get these complex networks to actually perform in a way that you get to a product which at the very large scale makes sense, but makes sense all the way down to the detail of the facade, down to the piece of a window wall that that's been designed and manufactured. right? So the management of these ecosystems requires a rethinking of how you break down organizations into units. And we know, actually, that creative networks work best in under 12 people. Why is it that your studio is 12 people, 12 to 15, right? Why is it that studios in practice are 12 to 15 people? It's because the only way to manage these things is to nest creative networks as nodes within this larger universe of knowledge creation. So that these nodes can't be more than 10 or 12 people, right? And as a consequence, it's now possible to run fairly large and complex firms on the back of an envelope. Because if you can break it down to 12 people and you have simple metrics, you can actually run very complex organizations without a lot of the managerial infrastructure that was required in the industrial age when you had a Fordist kind of production. And that's what I've been working on, which is how to get people to eliminate whole systems of oversight and everything in order to have very simple rules for the management of networked practices that allow you to function as units that have integrity both financially and professionally, that have something to do with each other culturally and within a larger environment, but then functionally can float as integral units. Whether you're an individual, okay, so let's switch topics right now, which is if you're looking at affiliations within this structure to support the platform of practice, the way in which we've traditionally thought about it are that we have the practice, we have our key consultants and partners, and we have our clients and investors, right? And we're supported by these other areas, university, knowledge communities, professional associations, public stakeholders. And so in making the alchemy between all of the things that I've talked about now, the design of platforms and environments for work require you to think about strategic goals and objectives of the practice. You have to know what you want. Not on a project basis, but what you want overall. You need to have a culture that supports collaboration, and I don't mean collaboration in the sense that I'm the head of the team and I have multidisciplinary consultants. No. You have to actually integrate a work process. The people who are involved all have to be able to participate with their respective roles, but to give you their best talents. And the employed technologies and tools, the way in which you deal with your finance, all have to make sense in terms of setting up an environment. And it's an environment. It's ceased to be a structure in the old-fashioned sense. And it comes down to design of environments. I would tell you that for all of you who are looking for a job as opposed to going off on your own after school, it doesn't matter what job you have in terms of a position. What matters is what environment you're in. The environment, I would rather be the lowest person on the totem pole in a great environment than a top person in a bad environment. It's because in a bad environment, you learn toxic things, and in a good environment, doesn't matter, you participate and you can grow and thrive in a good environment. So even for myself, when I was making choices after school, I had one job offer which paid me a lot of money in a bad environment, and I had another job offer which didn't pay so much in a really good environment. But I can tell you that that you learn different things in a good environment. You have the ability to have autonomy. You are encouraged to do things beyond your own capabilities. The organization allows you the space in which to communicate with other people freely rather than to have everything abridged. So it conforms to the organizational networking principle that I've shown you before, but also allows you to wander through the different spaces so that you can see the entire operation, that it's transparent to you, right? Firms that are too compartmentalized, you don't learn enough about practice. You can never gain your independence because you don't know enough about the business. And so one of the reasons of taking you through painstakingly this kind of organizational model is because you have to be aware of all the things you need to know in order to be independent. But by working in bad environments, it's compartmentalized, and your ability to communicate with others about things on an easy way abridges your ability then to learn enough to be able to be independent. And the setup of the offices can either encourage it or not. So this is one firm that I've been associated with for a number of years, which is Snøhetta in Oslo in New York. And, you know, the collaborative nature of space mirrors a firm's philosophy and identity. And so the interesting things about this firm, which is based in had its origins in Norway and now has an office in New York, is the inclusiveness. They have a table, and it sits everyone in the office. So in Norway, they have these two enormous tables that seat 70 people. And in New York, we have a really huge table that seats everyone in the office. But it's this idea that everyone has a place in the environment, and it doesn't really matter what you're doing, you're all contributing to the work of the firm. And so the work process then is flexible. The social organization is more based around culture and not around task. Every job now requires different tasks. So it's not like the Fordist production where you're making an automobile and you need to put the door on, and then you need to put the handle on, and then you need to paint it, right? This kind of mechanical work is not the work of an architect right now. It is for a service company, but if you really want to be a designer, you can't approach it like that. So creative organizations work on discipline, but they also work on social organizations that allow you to evolve methods of work which are effective and not ones which are by rote. So the actual setting up of the office is either something that allows you to emphasize this or to discourage it. So that's a small practice. Now here's a large practice with a slightly different message. I mean, it is inclusive in the sense that it's transparent, everyone can see each other, but it's a global delivery platform at this point, and Lord Foster's firm it's a 24/7 operation. It's a global firm, and it doesn't quite have that intimacy that Snøhetta has in New York, but it's an efficient global practice that does good work, but they're set up in a slightly different way. But what can I say? I mean, I think that you have to decide what kind of environment you want to be. This is also a great learning environment, but it's a different deal, right? And it does work on a 24/7 basis, but then you're a global practitioner. Okay, I don't know whether this ramble has been great for you or not, but there are useful resources. One of them is Broderick. This is the website, broderickco.com, if you want to know more. She's a great Maureen Broderick is really great in terms of understanding how to manage professional services or organizations. And if you want to know more about organizational design, Naomi Stanford has written a number of books. It's a complex region. You can give courses on subcategories of organizational design. Trying to give you an oversight on the subject. And I don't know whether I've managed to do that, but there it is. So, is that clear as mud? Any questions? Michael, you want to?
Find that, thank you. What would you say to students, or any professional, for that matter, who decides that they're going to embark on and open an office after they graduate from school, and there's 2 of them or 3 of them, and they all share the same common interests of design, and that's sort of the extent of what they share, or their interests. But they're really eager to open an office and start designing buildings. So what would you?
Well,
I mean,
you know,
you've talked about it today, but in a sort of nutshell, what might you say?
It's kind of a different world in terms of how people act in the world right now. So, the thing is, nobody really starts or should start alone. Let's put it that way. And even if you have 3 or 4 people who want to start together, that in itself is not. That's an island. That's not a network. The difference between my generation and the current generation. So the current generation hunts in a network fashion and not singularly. The baby boom, my generation tried to hunt as singular individuals. So the whole thing was to puff yourself up, get famous, blah, 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 get notoriety, teach, talk, and then use your aura as the leverage point of getting people to hire you, right? Well, that's not entirely a model that's dissipated. The thing is that the nature, other than domestic architecture, which still can be pursued individually, but other than at the domestic scale, if you're going for things that are much more complex, at a complex urban scale or whatever, it requires a level of technical skill that means that if you don't have it, but you do have good ideas, you almost inevitably have to go after it with a group, right? So a lot of the younger practitioners who don't have that much experience but have really great ideas and who are very gifted, if they have the presence of mind to be able to get other people interested who have that experience and are able then to work in a team to go after things, you have a much better chance of having a sustainable enterprise. Otherwise, it's kind of a one-off. Maybe exciting, but then it goes like this and then goes like that, right? So then, I mean, if you're young and you want, look, if you have to try it when you're coming out of school, there's no one who says you can't do it, right? So I'm the last person to say, yeah, you can't do it. It's, you know, don't try it. Blah blah blah. No, okay. If you got it in you and you want to give it your best, fine. But I think there are ways that are sustainable and ways that probably don't lead to sustainability. And one of the things that everyone has to come to grips with is that the complexities of the world means that if your ambition is to take on things of a larger scope, you need to figure out who else is with you on your posse. You can't be the Lone Ranger in this economy, right? And even locally, I mean, there are too many other people who are qualified. So the question is, why you, right? I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I mean, I think that, and the other thing is that individual achievement, I think, is very much within a broader context. So it's very hard, I think, on younger people to look at an older generation who, you know, kind of glorified in self-promotion, to think that, you know, that's the way forward. I actually don't think so. I don't honestly feel that that's a sustainable way forward for most people. I think there will always be the exceptions that do that, but I'm not so sure that that's what I would venture for 99% of everybody who tries this. Anyone else? And is the language so foreign to you that it's interesting? You know, this language I don't expect to be. It's not the language of designers. So this is I'm speaking to you in kind of a foreign language. So don't be embarrassed. I mean, that's why I keep repeating it, because myself in terms of every lecture, is because I think that it really isn't a language that comes naturally to people. But, yeah.
They're limited to about 12 people, or a smaller group that are independent financially and as a design unit. I'm wondering, from your experience, which companies have you seen what has grows into a very, very large scale? I mean, you mentioned Snowheader, it's a bigger firm, but it's not like a several hundred people firm. And I'm just wondering, like looking at Foster, for example, I'm not sure that they're a network firm.
No,
they're a top-down firm.
Yeah.
Very corporate in the organization structure. So I'm just wondering, like, this is a new model, obviously, and like, how do you see it? Can it grow to a mega scale or to a larger scale, or does it have its limitations?
It has its limitations, but I think that one of the problems of the large scale, I think that what's driven the aggregation of practice to the larger scale has basically been driven by finance and risk. It has not been driven by an innate need for a larger scale. Let's put it that way. Because in fact, the way and the mechanics of work is that when you have a large commission, people pay you after you've done the work. So somebody has had to put up the money for the payroll and for the expense of running an office in advance of actually getting paid for the work that you've done. So on a very, very large scale of commission, the amount of money that's owed to you at any given time can be in the millions of dollars. There are very few individuals who can have the credit, even for large firms. So, you know, firm of 1,000 people, you have 20 partners, and say you have receivables of $70, $80 million. Well, and you have 20 partners, so that works out to $4 million per partner. It's like, okay, like, so someone's in hock, you know, for a lot of money, and so a lot of the consolidation in the business has been caused because at the top scale of global practice, where you have these really large commissions that are billions of dollars, someone's got to put up millions of dollars in advance of actually getting paid the fee, which is always at risk, because if someone doesn't like what you did, or politically something happens, you might not get paid. Or as in the case of the Middle East, they had a meltdown, and then the developers goes, well, I would pay you if I had the money, but I don't, so sorry. So, there's a gap right now between really large practice, and the middle has been eviscerated because it costs too much to practice in the mid-size because of this organizational problem, which is the mid-sized firm has to make choices about how it's organized, which leads probably to too much cost in terms of management. Whereas if you blow the thing up to a really large scale, they pay you an additional fee to manage the work. So like Skidmore will get a fee independent from the architecture to manage the project on behalf of the owner. So they get owner project management fees of a certain percentage, and then they get the architectural fee, and then, so, but at the medium scale, you're not dealing with a project at this scale where an owner is willing to pay you multiple fees to manage the work and to, right? And so that scale is a very difficult one to negotiate. At the small scale, having units of 12 people, you can have very simple metrics that have more to do with productivity and dollars billed per individual than to look at timesheets and look at project profitability and with a fine-tooth comb and everything, all of which takes a lot of time and managerial thing. So what the trajectory of practice has been over the last 20 years has been increasing amounts of management time being spent for diminishing amounts of time spent on design, which is caused by basically the inability to come to grips with a communication system which no longer follows the structural model of roles and responsibilities, which is essentially now a fiction on paper. and not being able to put in managerial systems that are essentially simple to follow and don't require the level of oversight that this other kind of elaborate scheme requires. But no one talks about the rules of the game anymore, right? I mean, everyone just talks about management rules and everything. You're like, okay, but you're driving, everyone's driving themselves into bankruptcy because they're not willing to change, come to grips with the reality of the present, which is, whatever your pyramid structure says, it's a fiction. So let's get to the real deal, which is how do you really practice in a way that's effective and make decisions which are sound and don't put you or the client at undue risk for decisions that you're making. But that's where the 12 thing comes up. But I don't think Foster can follow that thing because he's a global design platform at this point, and they have to act like a very large company. They don't follow the scalar model.
Would you say Herzog and Demeron's office is more on the network setup?
Probably even OMA. OMA is like 350 people. I don't think OMA's reached Foster's level of kind of organization. So, the whole issue of organization is multifaceted and complex, and I would say that it's one of the most confusing areas of practice because everyone means something different when they talk about organization. Is it right? So I mean, there are too many facets to talk about, and even I get wrapped up and I get confused about like what I'm saying because the thing is they're all interlinked, but they're all separate topics, and so people continually chase their tail trying to figure this thing out. But it's what do you want out of it? Do you want the quality of work to? I mean, what are the questions you're asking yourself about the organizational model? Is it about culture? Is it about organizational efficiency? Is it about decision making? Is it about finance? And each of those lenses informs the discussion. But I think that people who are starting out, it's bewildering because you see all these people running around doing all these things, and you know, half the time you think it's being done to you rather than you doing anything, right? So it's just one of those areas where I think that for young practitioners, having some sort of conceptual models in your mind about what might be going on is useful, because even if you can't control it, you go like, okay, I get it. You know, I know what field of action this thing's being played out on. So that's all these tools are for. They're navigational. They're not definitive. It's just so that you're oriented in terms of what play is going down in front of you, or where you find yourself on the field of action yourself. Anyone else? Okie doke. Well, thank you very much.